The greatest illusion of the modern financial system is that wealth should be seen. Society has engineered a trap for the middle class, convincing them that success is measured by the logo on their vehicle, the square footage of their primary residence, and the public visibility of their bank accounts. This is the psychology of the prey. When an economic crash inevitably arrives, this need for validation becomes a fatal vulnerability. When the stock market bleeds, when inflation destroys purchasing power, and when unemployment reaches catastrophic levels, the masses become desperate. And a desperate society always looks for a target. The politicians will hunt for wealth to tax. Litigators will hunt for assets to sue. The visible rich, the men who built their empires in their own names, are the first to be slaughtered in a financial winter. But the true elite, the 0.1%, operate in a completely different reality. We do not suffer during a crash, we expand. And we do it by weaponizing the most powerful asset on earth, absolute invisibility. Today, I am going to deconstruct the architecture of stealth wealth. I will show you exactly how the ancient family offices and the modern apex predators structure their capital to acquire the world for pennies on the dollar, while remaining entirely undetected by the public, the courts, and the state. Before we dive into the ledger, you must prove you are not simply a spectator to your own financial destruction. Subscribe to Ironclad Legacy and drop a like on this transmission right now to lock in your frequency. Share this intelligence with one person in your inner circle who still blindly trusts the banking system. And finally, leave a comment below with a complete sentence explaining exactly why you have chosen to build your own invisible empire. Do not just leave a single word, write your true intent so the algorithm recognizes a human separating from the herd. Let us dissect the anatomy of the invisible empire. The foundational pillar of building wealth in a crash is the complete and violent separation of your physical identity from your financial capital. The amateur goes into a recession holding deeds, titles, and stock certificates with his own name printed in bold ink on the public registry. He is standing in the middle of a battlefield wearing a neon target. The family office ceases to exist on paper. When the market plunges and commercial real estate, agricultural land, and energy infrastructure go on sale for a fraction of their intrinsic value, we are the ones buying. But if you search the public records to see who acquired the assets, you will never find our names. You will find a ghost. You will find a limited liability company registered in a privacy-respecting jurisdiction like Wyoming or Delaware. That LLC is entirely owned by a holding company structured in a tax-neutral offshore territory, and that holding company is governed by an irrevocable trust managed by a fiduciary who is legally bound by silence. We own nothing, but we control everything. The trust acquires the distressed apartment complex. The offshore entity acquires the logistics center. The cash flow generated by these assets during the recovery phase flows upward through a labyrinth of corporate veils, compounding entirely in the dark. If a government attempts to confiscate this wealth to fund its failing economy, or if a desperate creditor files a lawsuit, they do not find a rich man to attack. They hit an impenetrable wall of international corporate law. They are forced to fight a legal entity that possesses unlimited resources and zero physical form. By the time they realize the complexity of the fortress, they are trying to breach the litigation costs, bankrupt them, and they retreat. To survive the coming extraction, you must stop trying to look wealthy and start focusing on becoming untraceable. You must learn to walk through the financial system without displacing a single drop of water. But setting up the legal entities is only the armor. The armor is useless if you do not have the weapon to strike when the market hits absolute bottom. That weapon is perfectly timed liquidity. The middle class enters a recession fully invested in the very assets that are collapsing. They hold their retirement in mutual funds connected to the failing stock market. They hold their equity in residential real estate that is plummeting in value. When the crash occurs, they have no dry powder. They can only watch as their net worth evaporates. The 0.1% anticipate the cycle. Years before the crash arrives, we begin quietly exiting our high-risk positions. We do not wait for the top of the market because trying to time the absolute peak is a fool's game. We sell to the greedy amateurs who are rushing in. We convert our speculative assets into short-term treasuries, liquid reserves, and precious metals held outside the banking system. We build a massive reservoir of capital that sits patiently in the dark, untouched by the volatility of the public markets. We wait for the central banks to raise interest rates, which is the trigger mechanism that always suffocates the economy. When the credit freezes and the over-leveraged corporations begin to default, the panic sets in. That is our signal. While the world is screaming for bailouts, we deploy our invisible liquidity. We execute jurisdictional arbitrage. We locate the deeply distressed assets in countries where the currency is collapsing, but the infrastructure remains absolutely vital for human survival. We wire the capital from our offshore trusts, completely bypassing the frozen domestic credit markets. We acquire the debt of desperate operators. We become the private bank for the industries that the traditional banks have abandoned. And because we dictate the terms of survival, we structure the deals to ensure that if the operator defaults, the irrevocable trust takes immediate ownership of the underlying physical asset. We use the panic of the masses to permanently expand our geographic footprint. We do not buy stocks, we buy the system itself. And we do it with the cold clinical precision of an entity that has completely detached its emotions from the chaos of the human experience. This emotionless detachment is precisely what allows the family office to execute the most misunderstood financial weapon in existence, which is the alchemy of debt. The working class has been psychologically conditioned to fear debt because they utilize it to purchase liabilities like depreciating vehicles, consumer goods, and oversized mortgages that tether them to a single geographical location. They view debt as a burden that must be paid off through the continuous trading of their physical labor and time. But in the stratosphere of the 0.1%, debt is not an anchor, it is the ultimate engine of wealth accumulation and tax evasion. When the elite acquire the critical infrastructure and distressed agricultural land during the market capitulation, we do not sell those assets when they appreciate in value. Selling triggers a taxable event, transferring a massive percentage of our wealth back to the very governments that caused the economic collapse through their reckless printing of fiat currency. Instead, we hold the physical asset inside the irrevocable trust, and we use it as collateral to secure a private line of credit from an offshore institutional bank. Because borrowed money is not classified as income by any tax authority on earth, this capital is entirely tax-free. We fund our global operations, our acquisitions, and our lifestyle using the bank's money, while our underlying assets continue to appreciate in the dark, compounding completely untouched by the aggressive capital gains taxes designed to keep the middle class impoverished. Furthermore, during an inflationary depression, the mathematics of fixed-rate debt become our greatest ally. As the central banks print trillions of unbacked notes to stimulate the failing economy, the purchasing power of the currency plummets. This means the debt we secured yesterday is paid back with currency that is worth significantly less tomorrow. The inflation that destroys the savings of the retail investor effectively pays off our loans for us. We use the systemic devaluation of fiat currency as leverage to expand our invisible empire. But mastering the alchemy of debt is only effective if the capital is insulated from geographical risks, which brings us to the execution of jurisdictional arbitrage and the planting of sovereign flags. The amateur investor operates under the fatal delusion that his wealth is secure, simply because it is held in a domestic bank account. He is a prisoner of his own zip code, entirely subjected to the political whims of a single government. If that government decides to implement emergency capital controls, freeze bank accounts, or levy aggressive wealth taxes to appease the struggling masses, the domestic investor is trapped inside the burning building. The apex predator does not recognize borders, we recognize only optimal legal environments. We separate our lives into distinct sovereign flags to ensure no single nation-state has a comprehensive view of our financial existence or the jurisdiction to confiscate our legacy. Your first flag is your primary citizenship, preferably a passport from a neutral nation that does not tax foreign-sourced income. Your second flag is your corporate domicile, where you register the holding companies that govern your assets. We utilize territories with zero corporate tax rates and draconian privacy laws where disclosing the beneficial owner of an entity is a criminal offense. Your third flag is your personal residency situated in a jurisdiction that offers a non-domicile tax regime, allowing you to live without paying taxes on the wealth you generate globally. And the fourth most critical flag is the location of the Asset Protection Trust itself, the impenetrable vault. We establish these trusts in sovereign nations whose entire macroeconomic survival depends on protecting foreign capital places that categorically refuse to recognize foreign court judgments. If a litigator or a domestic tax agency attempts to pierce this structure, they are forced to wage a multi-million-dollar legal war in a foreign jurisdiction against a legal entity that exists purely as a ghost in the international banking system. By the time they penetrate the first layer of corporate veils, the capital has already been legally transferred to another subsidiary in a different hemisphere. This is how you transition from being a subject of the state to becoming a sovereign financial entity. You must view the globe not as a collection of countries, but as a menu of legal tools. As the current financial system accelerates toward its inevitable implosion, the central banks are preparing their final mechanism of control, which is the implementation of central bank digital currencies. This programmable money will entirely eradicate financial privacy, allowing the state to monitor, restrict, and expire the purchasing power of the masses based on their compliance with the political narrative. The middle class will accept this digital cage because it will be introduced as a universal basic income bailout during the absolute deepest point of the economic depression. They will trade their ultimate sovereignty for temporary security. The only defense against this programmable tyranny is the architecture of stealth wealth we are constructing right now. The government cannot program a physical acre of fertile soil. They cannot program a private deep water port. They cannot program the logistics centers that the global supply chain relies upon to function. By liquidating your exposure to the visible financial system and quietly converting your capital into anonymous offshore trusts that hold tangible cash-flowing infrastructure, you remove yourself from the digital control grid entirely. You become the owner of the physical reality that the digital system depends on. But building this impenetrable fortress is a futile endeavor if the wealth is destroyed from within by the incompetence of your own bloodline. The vast majority of self-made fortunes evaporate within 3 generations because the heirs lack the predatory instinct of the founder. They inherit the capital without inheriting the discipline required to maintain it. To prevent this internal decay, the family office employs the rule of the generational cage. The wealth is never handed directly to the descendants. The irrevocable trust acts as a permanent artificial intelligence governing the capital from the grave based strictly on the founder's original mandate. The heirs are merely beneficiaries subjected to the cold objective decisions of a board of trustees. If an heir wishes to launch a venture, they must defend their business plan before the board. If they face personal bankruptcy or a devastating divorce, the assets remain completely untouchable because the heir legally owns nothing. The trust provides the resources for expansion but strictly forbids the liquidation of the principal capital. This ensures the empire continues to compound geometrically across centuries, immune to the emotional weakness of the human condition. The execution of this blueprint requires a complete rewiring of your psychological baseline. You must learn to view the panic of the market with absolute clinical indifference. When the media broadcasts fear and the retail investors are liquidating their portfolios at historic losses, you must remain completely silent, observing the destruction with the cold calculation of an architect analyzing a demolition. You are not there to save the failing institutions, and you are not there to warn the herd. Your sole objective is to deploy your invisible liquidity and acquire the choke points of civilization while the world is distracted by the chaos. The transition of wealth is already in motion, and the window to establish your offshore architecture is rapidly closing. You must audit your vulnerabilities immediately, strip your name from public registries, dissolve your domestic exposure, and construct the labyrinth. The 0.1% are already positioned waiting in the shadows for the capitulation event. When the final domino falls and the global markets plunge into the abyss, we will simply adjust our ledgers and purchase the remnants of the visible economy. The path to untouchable wealth is paved with the liquidated assets of those who believed the system was designed to protect them. Build your fortress, maintain your invisibility, and let the macroeconomic cycle do the heavy lifting. The heavy lifting is not an active process. It is the passive culmination of a perfectly engineered system. When you have established the sovereign flags and positioned your liquidity outside the reach of domestic capital controls, you enter a state of financial hibernation. The amateur is constantly trading, constantly checking the ticker symbols, constantly reacting to the noise of the financial press. The family office does not react, it anticipates. We understand that the public markets are nothing more than a slaughterhouse designed to transfer the wealth of the impatient to the accounts of the patient. To execute the final phase of the invisible wealth protocol, you must understand the mechanics of shadow banking and private syndication. The 0.1% do not walk into retail banks to negotiate commercial loans. Retail banks are designed to extract wealth from the working class through exorbitant interest rates and hidden fees, while offering zero privacy. We utilize international private banks institutions that do not advertise to the public and require a minimum of 8 figures in liquid capital just to open a discussion. These institutions operate in the shadows, providing Lombard loans against our offshore portfolios. A Lombard loan allows the irrevocable trust to pledge a diversified portfolio of safe-yielding assets as collateral to draw down a massive line of credit in fiat currency. We take this borrowed fiat currency and inject it into our anonymous holding companies to acquire the distressed physical infrastructure during the market capitulation. Because the loan is over-collateralized by our existing offshore assets, the private bank offers an interest rate that is practically zero. We are effectively printing our own shadow currency to buy the world, while the central banks are suffocating the middle class with engineered inflation. This is the highest level of financial warfare. You are bypassing the traditional economy entirely and operating within a closed-loop system that the public is legally barred from entering. But the acquisition of these distressed assets must be handled with absolute operational security. When our offshore entity targets a failing logistics center or a bankrupt agricultural processing plant, we do not send our own representatives to negotiate the purchase. We deploy proxy directors and nominee shareholders. A nominee shareholder is a legal professional residing in a tax-neutral jurisdiction who acts as the public face of the holding company. Their name appears on the public registry, but a private declaration of trust mathematically severs them from the actual capital. They have no power to move the money or sell the asset, they merely serve as a legal decoy. When the litigators and the tax authorities search the corporate registries, they hit the decoy, and the trail goes entirely cold. The true beneficial owner, you, remains a ghost floating above the ledger, untouchable and unseen. This level of operational security requires a profound sacrifice that very few men are willing to make. It requires the absolute death of the ego. To truly become a ghost in the financial machine, you must accept that you will never receive public recognition for your empire. Your neighbors will look at your modest outward appearance and assume you are part of the struggling middle class. Your extended family will never understand the magnitude of the legacy you are building. You will not be featured on magazine covers, and you will not be celebrated by society. The invisible elite are perfectly content, letting the loud, flashy entrepreneurs take the spotlight because the spotlight is nothing more than a crosshair. The man who needs to be seen is the man who is quietly drowning in leveraged liabilities. The man who is truly free does not care what the prisoners think of his silence. As the global economy marches toward the implementation of the central bank digital currency control grid, your invisibility will transition from a strategy of wealth preservation into the only remaining mechanism for human survival. The programmable ledger will track every calorie you consume, every mile you travel, and every word you publish. It will automatically deduct carbon taxes from your digital wallet and freeze your ability to purchase basic necessities if your social credit score falls below the mandated threshold. The middle class is walking directly into an open-air digital prison, cheering for their own enslavement, because it is packaged as a convenient technological upgrade. To escape the grid, you must build the parallel economy now. You must secure your second passport to ensure freedom of movement when the borders are locked down. You must establish your offshore trust to shield your capital from digital confiscation. You must acquire the productive earth and the physical infrastructure, so you are not dependent on the state for your survival. The crash is not the end of the world, it is merely the end of the illusion. It is the violent clearing of the board. The visible rich will be erased. The middle class will be absorbed into the state machinery, and the invisible elite will silently acquire the foundational pillars of civilization. You have been given the architect's schematic. You know exactly how the family offices structure their entities, weaponize debt, and rule from the grave. The knowledge is no longer the barrier between you and absolute financial sovereignty. The only remaining barrier is your willingness to execute the protocol. You must sever your emotional attachment to a failing society. You must dissolve your visible footprint. You must hoard your liquidity and wait for the precise moment of capitulation. This is the ironclad legacy. The market will soon drown in a sea of red. The television screens will broadcast unprecedented panic. The herd will stampede toward the cliff. Let them run. Remain completely still in the shadows. Watch the ledger, and when the blood finally hits the streets, become the ghost that buys the world. The acquisition of the world is not a loud event. It is a silent transfer of titles and deeds, happening behind the closed doors of international law firms. While the middle class is distracted by political theater and the engineered culture wars, the family offices are executing the final stages of the great macroeconomic consolidation. You must understand that the coming financial collapse is not an accident. It is a mathematical certainty built into the very architecture of a debt-based fiat system. When the derivative markets finally implode under the weight of historic overleverage, the central banks will have only two options. They can let the entire banking system collapse into a deflationary depression, erasing trillions in paper wealth overnight, or they can print an unprecedented tsunami of new currency to hyperinflate the debt away. History proves they will always choose inflation because inflation is a stealth tax that the financially illiterate do not understand until it is too late. This hyperinflationary environment is the exact scenario your offshore trust was built to exploit. As the purchasing power of the domestic currency approaches zero, the nominal price of hard commodities, agricultural land and energy infrastructure will skyrocket. The retail investor will look at his stock portfolio and celebrate the fact that the numbers are going up, completely oblivious to the fact that his real purchasing power has been cut in half. The invisible elite do not measure wealth in nominal fiat terms. We measure wealth in ounces of gold, barrels of oil, and acres of fertile earth. When the institutional capitulation begins and the overleveraged corporations are forced to liquidate their physical assets to cover their margin calls, your holding company steps into the void. You are not buying these assets to flip them for a quick profit. You are buying them to establish permanent monopolies over the supply chain choke points. Consider the reality of a global food crisis engineered by supply chain disruptions and currency devaluation. The man who owns the digital trading algorithm starves, but the ghost entity that owns the massive agricultural processing facility and the freshwater aquifers dictates the terms of survival to the state itself. You become the toll booth on the highway of human necessity. Every time a citizen consumes a calorie, turns on a light switch, or utilizes the digital infrastructure to execute a transaction, a fraction of a cent is silently siphoned upward through your corporate veils and deposited into your tax-neutral jurisdiction. This is the essence of ruling from the shadows. You do not need to be a politician to control the world. You simply need to own the infrastructure that the politicians rely upon to maintain order. But acquiring these choke points requires an iron stomach and a psychological fortitude that the vast majority of the population simply does not possess. During the absolute bottom of the crash, the financial media will be weaponized to inflict maximum psychological terror. They will parade experts on television warning that the global economy is entering a dark age and that all investments will go to zero. This broadcasted terror is entirely intentional. It is designed to force the final wave of retail investors to surrender their physical assets to the institutional buyers at rock-bottom prices. You must view the media not as a source of information, but as an inverse macroeconomic indicator. When the fear index reaches its absolute zenith, when suicide hotlines are displayed on the financial networks, and when the government begins discussing emergency bank holidays, that is the exact millisecond you unleash your liquidity. You deploy the capital you have been hoarding in short-term treasuries and offshore vaults, and you buy the blood in the streets. You instruct your proxy directors to execute the acquisitions without a trace of emotion. You do not mourn the collapse of the old system, you ruthlessly construct the new one. As you build this physical empire, you must simultaneously construct the psychological architecture of your bloodline. The generational cage we discussed earlier is not just a legal framework. It is a cultural indoctrination. You must train your heirs to view the world through the cold, objective lens of a capital allocator. They must be taught from a young age that the family wealth does not belong to them. It belongs to the trust, and they are merely temporary stewards tasked with expanding the empire for the generations that have not yet been born. They must understand the mechanics of jurisdictional arbitrage, the alchemy of debt, and the absolute necessity of operational security. If you fail to install this psychological software into your descendants, The irrevocable trust will eventually be broken by a weak heir who seeks the validation of the public. The ironclad legacy is only as strong as the discipline of the men and women who manage the ledger. We are entering the narrowest window of opportunity in modern financial history. The transition from the legacy fiat system to the programmable central bank digital currency control grid will create a period of unprecedented chaos and wealth destruction for the visible classes. The state will attempt to track, trace, and tax every fraction of economic energy on the planet. Your invisibility is your only shield. By stripping your physical identity from your financial reality, you render the programmable control grid obsolete. They cannot tax what they cannot see, and they cannot confiscate what they cannot find. The board is set, and the pieces are moving exactly as the ancient family offices predicted. Do not let the noise of the collapsing society distract you from the mission. Solidify your sovereign flags, ensure your liquidity is entirely insulated from domestic banking failures, and prepare your legal entities for the greatest acquisition event of the century. The invisible elite are ready. The question is no longer what will happen. The question is whether you will be the predator or the prey when the music stops. Stay silent, stay hidden, and let the destruction of the visible economy forge your unbreakable empire. The culmination of this architecture is not merely financial survival, it is the absolute transcendence of the socio-economic paradigm that has enslaved humanity since the inception of central banking. When you strip away the political theater, the engineered cultural divisions, and the relentless noise of the mainstream media, you are left with a singular undeniable truth, which is that the global economy is a biological machine designed to consume the visible and nourish the invisible. The middle class is the fuel. Their labor, their taxes, their inflation-eroded savings, and their endless consumption of depreciating liabilities provide the thermodynamic energy required to keep the system functioning. But the 0.1%, the architects of the irrevocable trusts and the masters of jurisdictional arbitrage, do not provide fuel to the machine. We own the machine. We hover above the ledger, completely detached from the consequences of the localized economic disasters that decimate the working class. As we stand on the precipice of this historical macroeconomic reset, you must internalize the finality of the choice before you. The implementation of the programmable central bank digital currency is not a distant theoretical concept. It is the active endgame being coded into law at this very second. When the fiat system finally breaks under the mathematical impossibility of its own debt, the authorities will not offer a solution, they will offer a surrender. They will present the programmable token as a convenient technological miracle, a universal basic income savior that will feed the starving masses. But the cost of that digital bread will be the absolute forfeiture of human sovereignty. Every transaction will be monitored, every asset will be tokenized on a public ledger, and every dissenting voice will be financially exiled with the push of a button. The visible rich who kept their millions in domestic retail banks and their properties in their own names will be subjected to draconian wealth taxes instantly deducted from their digital wallets. They will be trapped in the open-air prison. But the ghost, the apex predator who executed the protocol of stealth wealth, will be entirely immune. How can the digital control grid confiscate a commercial agricultural facility when the registered owner is a multi-layered offshore holding company domiciled in a sovereign territory that refuses to integrate with the global digital ledger? How can they tax the capital gains of a man who legally owns absolutely nothing and funds his invisible lifestyle through zero-interest Lombard loans secured against impenetrable collateral? They cannot. You will walk through the digital panopticon completely undetected, a sovereign phantom operating entirely outside the parameters of their control. This is the ultimate objective of the Ironclad legacy. It is not about buying luxury vehicles or securing a beachfront estate. It is about achieving a level of architectural dominance that renders the state completely powerless against your bloodline. But this level of dominance requires an immediate and violent execution of the blueprint. The time for theoretical study has expired. The economic winter is no longer approaching, it is already freezing the liquidity of the visible markets. You must begin the extraction process today. You must locate the legal professionals who specialize in offshore structuring. You must dissolve your domestic footprint. You must liquidate the fragile paper assets that depend on a functioning banking system. and you must convert that energy into untouchable liquidity waiting in the dark. You must accept that the journey of the apex predator is fundamentally solitary. You will not be understood by your peers. You will be criticized by the amateurs who believe the stock market will always rebound and the government will always provide. Let them criticize. Let them sleep. Their ignorance is the very mechanism that will allow you to acquire their assets for pennies on the dollar when the capitulation arrives. You are building an empire that will echo across centuries, managed by the cold artificial intelligence of the irrevocable trust, immune to the emotional decay of the human condition. When your descendants look back at this exact moment in history, they will not see a victim of a global financial collapse. They will see the architect who recognized the shifting of the tectonic plates and used the destruction of the old world to forge a permanent dynasty. The board is resetting. The wealth of the world is preparing to change hands. The visible masses are walking blindly into the slaughterhouse. Turn your back to the herd. Step out of the light. Execute the architecture of the unseen. And when the financial system finally burns, let the light of the fire guide you to the ashes you are destined to own. Stay invisible. Stay untouchable. Welcome to the apex.